I wish to first of all place on record my thanks to the RCSS for organizing this session and for providing us, citizens of South Asia, and I think members of international civil society, as we would like to call ourselves, a platform to articulate our viewpoints about some of the burning issues, particularly faced by vulnerable communities in Afghanistan. So thank you very much. And I want to thank you too, Professor Keerawella. I listened with great interest to what the two distinguished professors said before me, and I cannot be in agreement more with what they're saying, the sort of contradictions within Afghanistan, the several narratives within Afghanistan, the rural-urban divide, and the fact that what Professor Rais said, despite all these, failings in the past 20 years in nation building and so on, you cannot deny the fact that liberalization, building of state institutions, democratic institutions, and in particular, providing opportunities to women has really had an impact. And I think also providing constitutional protection to vulnerable communities, women, the minorities, and so on, that's left an indelible mark. And these are the demands that are being made today. And I don't see where women are concerned, this neat division into urban and rural, because even rural women, I think, are banking on educational opportunities and so on. And there's the fear that all those opportunities at self-improvement and advancement will disappear. So I don't come here, as Professor Keerawella said, as a country specialist on Afghanistan, but someone who, is a student of public international law and human rights, and who's extremely concerned about country situations, wherever it may be, our own countries, now Myanmar, Afghanistan, wherever there are, serious potential for violation, we are concerned. So first, looking at public international law implications for this sudden change in Afghanistan, we all know it is about regime, recognition. That is, of course, in everybody's thoughts. So, of course, in terms of recognizing the regime, sovereign states, it's a question of their sovereignty, whether they wish to acknowledge and accept and have diplomatic relations with the Taliban regime. That we have to wait and see. Most countries, barring a few, are waiting, adopting a very wait and see approach, and making recognition conditional on various dimensions. I think one of the predominant conditions, I would think, if not the main one, is about human rights protection and so on. So I think that we will have to wait and see. But all are waiting, I think, to see how the United Nations will respond if the Taliban regime does present credentials for the seat in the United Nations General Assembly, because that would be really, it will send a very big message about how the international community, because that's what the General Assembly is responding to the situation. If you look at the past, between 1996 and 2000, when Taliban was in power, after capture of Kabul in 1996, the Rabbani government had presented its credentials to the Credentials Committee for recognition as the legitimate representative in the United Nations of Afghanistan in the United Nations. Then a month or a couple of months later, the Taliban also submitted rather the protest that the Rabbani representative is not the legitimate representative. However, it did not present its own credentials. So the UN Credentials Committee, then looking at all these, and obviously we all know that geopolitics matter here a lot, they just deferred the issue. Which meant that the representative of the Rabbani government continued. So Taliban was not given that opportunity or the recognition. So it remains to be seen now that the Taliban government is, in terms of its rhetoric in the recent weeks, And surely that's a result of the liberalization in the past 20 years have been making liberal claims to having inclusive government and so on. Whether it is going to be given that recognition in the United Nations, whether it will present its credentials, whether in fact the government of the president, who almost one would say, well, abdicated government, would present its own credentials as a ousted, democratically elected government, and if there is such a tug of war, what will really happen. So this will be interesting to see, but these are all possibilities of prevailing upon the Taliban government. Of course, the rhetoric was one thing, and what we have seen in the form of the appointment of ministers and so on has proven that it's quite limited to rhetoric, and the action has failed thus far. So in terms of human rights protection, I think women are the most panic-stricken, aside from other vulnerable communities, particularly the ethnic minorities. The fact is that the state of Afghanistan remained bound by its international human rights obligations. It's very interesting that that Afghanistan has quite a fair record of ratification of human rights treaties. And these ratifications or accessions had taken place in the 1980s. And then subsequently, after the changes in 2001 with the interim authority, I think, taking over, and with this project of liberalization, democratization, etc., you see again another set of human rights treaties being ratified. So you see most of the major human rights treaties, barring very few, have been ratified by the state of Afghanistan. And so those remain, as we know, in public international law. Governments come and go, but state obligations remain. So what are some of these treaties? The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, very important for representative government, for democracy, among many other rights. And then, of course, CEDAW, which is very important for women, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that had been ratified way back, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Rights of the Child Convention, the Convention Against Torture, and so on, and the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Convention. These have all been ratified, and I checked to see whether Afghanistan, even in its moment of liberalization, had second thoughts and had entered reservations, but I could not see reservations, for example, to CEDAW, because one of the major claims is that because of Sharia, that international human rights norms cannot be implemented. So that's very interesting. Furthermore, it's very interesting that in 2003, Afghanistan ratified the Statute of the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute. It's very interesting. And there is a pending investigation before the International Criminal Court. It dragged on for a long period of time. After its ratification in 2003, many complaints came in, and the prosecutor sought permission of a pretrial chamber to start a formal investigation. It was much later, that was the case, 2017, the pretrial chamber rejected it, saying too much of time had lapsed between 2006, when the first the investigation started, what they call an examination. So they rejected it, but it went up on appeal to the appeals chamber of the court. And the appeals chamber then reversed the judgment of the pretrial chamber, and now formally there will be an investigation, which was announced in 2020. And this is precisely why President Trump then imposed sanctions on the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and a few other officials on the basis that they are working to impugn US armed forces, members of the armed forces, and so on. Of course, President Now it has been, President Biden has reversed that, sanctions. So it remains to be seen how this investigation will unfold, because that is not just about the Taliban and other militias, but it's also about the state actors and the foreign troops, which were the other NATO troops, the United States troops, and so on. Now, of course, in terms of human rights obligations, you see, particularly regarding women, the Taliban saying, of course, they will permit women to get an education, to go to work, but they have to put in place their own policies, which are in accordance with Sharia. So we'll have to wait and see what they do. But right now, the signs are rather ominous. Universities are providing education to women, but compartmentalized, segregated, and women have not been permitted to come to work, from what we understand. So whatever it is, it's not possible, as we know under international law, for the regime to plead local particularities, cultural particularities, not even religion, when it comes to international obligations the state has undertaken. So that's why I looked at reservations, and it's not going to be possible. There are no reservations. The other possibility is now Taliban could, theoretically, it could, even practically, it could renounce its international obligations. It could renounce its treaty, acceptance of treaties. But under international law, Afghanistan, as a member of the United Nations, will continue to be bound by what we call peremptory norms of human rights, customary international law norms. So it's not possible for Taliban to, again, get into this spree of torture, public executions, and all those very terrible forms of violations. And indeed, I would think that gender discrimination is also prohibited by customary international law. I would like to say that. Some would disagree, but I really think that racial discrimination and gender discrimination are covered there. So even renunciation of the treaty obligations would not have much impact when it comes to the international community's demands of the Taliban. So in terms of what the UN has done so far, I saw the other day the European Union has announced that it's going to wait and see. It's going to give an opportunity for the Taliban to act according to its rhetoric, and to see whether it is a reformed Taliban, whether it's a sort of a different incarnation of the Taliban, before accepting the regime. As far as the United Nations is concerned, we all know there was a Security Council resolution, which I think from the point of view of human rights advocates around the world, was quite mild at the moment. So perhaps it was giving an opportunity to the Taliban to, to prove its legitimacy through its actions. And of course, China and Russia abstained in the Security Council. So that is something we are going to see in the coming years. Even in fact, I think where the International Criminal Court is concerned, it's quite possible, because they could veto, and that's it, if that does happen. But anyway, that is another discussion. The United Nations Assistant Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA, which was established in the at the turn of the millennium, which had a sort of a development type of an agenda, which was headed by the UN Secretary General's special representative, who is now a Canadian diplomat. It ends, interestingly, on the 17th of this month. Their mandate ends. And one of their functions was to ensure these democratic institutions are facilitated, that human rights protection is aided and assisted, and so on. So today, in fact, we hear that the Security Council will have a meeting headed by the president, I think is an Irish diplomat, to examine whether the mandate of UNAMA should be extended or not. I certainly hope that the United Nations presence in Afghanistan will continue, because that is a source of great strength to the people of Afghanistan. I completely agree with Professor Rais that engagement at this point is important. While using a carrot and stick approach, disengagement would be a disaster for civilian protection. So that has to be said. And where the main actor in the United Nations on human rights is concerned, the UN Human Rights Council is concerned, and the High Commissioner's Office, High Commissioner for Human Rights Office is concerned. The High Commission, there was a special session in August, given this sudden and dramatic changes in Afghanistan. The High Commissioner read a very strong statement on what needs to be done. But there is general consensus now among human rights advocates, and I think governments which were expecting a strong position taken by the Human Rights Council, it adopted a resolution, but the resolution fell far short of any action it was going to take. It called on various parties to do various things and so on. Mainly refugee protection, which is very needed, undoubtedly, but it did not establish a mechanism to monitor the human rights situation at the ground level. And that is seen to be extremely a very weak position. And you see, interestingly, the incumbent chair of the National Human Rights Commission of Afghanistan, a very feisty, extremely admirable woman, sort of taking on the council and saying, you've let us down, you completely let us down, and the people of Afghanistan, this is not what we expected of you, you are just playing politics. So anyway, now that the next session of the Human Rights Council is due to meet in a couple of weeks, if not next week, I think we'll have to wait and see, and I hope all concerned will agitate for strong measures to monitor the human rights situation in Afghanistan. For any one of us who will be in the situation that many Afghani civilians are in, we would want that sort of attention on our behalf. And finally, because of the the reality that that Taliban, whatever policies it's going to put in place, whether it be about governance in general, whether it be about family relations, education for women, and so on, is going to be the framework of their Sharia. But of course, the Taliban interpretation of Sharia, it would be very interesting to see how Islamic countries respond to this. Because, for example, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, of which Afghanistan has been a member since 1969, has an extremely interesting and very almost moving, I would say, a charter on human rights, which refers to the final sermon of the Holy Prophet on Mount Arafat, and also referring to the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it claims that your human rights are universal in the Islamic context. Of course, it says without prejudice to Islamic principles that uphold the dignity and equal rights of the people. It recognizes equality between men and women in dignity and rights. So I think we've got to be creative about it. Now, if the Taliban are saying that according to the Sharia that the equality of men and women cannot be guaranteed, I think there is a huge role for Islamic states to play here. And I think organizations like the OIC, Organization of Islamic States, can play a very important role, because now, whether you like it or not, what is going to happen in Afghanistan will be taken as a sort of a reflection of how Islam is regarding various dimensions of human life, governance, equal opportunities, protection of dignity, and all that. We know that it is the Taliban's own interpretation of the Sharia and so on. But I think it's very important to point to what Professor Rais, this is my final sentence, Professor Keerawella, what Professor Rais said, one has to engage the Taliban, because at this moment, it's very important to ensure by engaging that, people of the country will receive the protection that they deserve, although it's going to be very difficult. But I think to completely disengage would make it possible for Taliban to go its own way, and it's going to be, I think, quite a disaster. But of course, we cannot forget the demand for democratization, elections, and so on. Nobody's calling this a transitional government, so we'll have to wait and see whether, whether they'll go on for a long period of time, what they will do to the constitution, and so on. So thank you very much for the opportunity.